Now, this week, a new report from the campaign group Global Justice Now says that two of the UK's biggest fossil fuel companies have secured combined profits just shy of £30 billion. Now, that's a figure greater than the combined GDP of 5 of the countries most vulnerable to climate change. And they claim these huge profits are unethical. So today we are asking, should it be illegal for fossil fuel companies to make large profits? And joining me to discuss this are Izzie McIntosh from Global Justice Now and Charles McAllister, energy consultant and former CEO of the UK onshore oil and gas trade body UKOOG. Welcome to both of you. Charles, I want to start with you. You worked in and have worked in the British oil and gas industry your entire career.
Yep.
When you hear those figures, that BP and Shell, those profits larger than the combined GDP of the 5 most climate vulnerable countries in the world,
Yep.
What do you make of that? Do you think that these companies have a responsibility to redress that inequality?
I think there's 3 points I'd like to make. First of all, the oil and gas industry is cyclical. You know, prices go up and down and therefore profits go up and down. So while it is true BP and Shell made 30 billion last year, in 2020 they lost 34 billion. That's the first point. Second point is attempts by groups to force down oil and gas production without actually going after demand guarantees price spikes. That's a serious issue. And the third thing is the profit motive is not exclusive to the oil and gas industry. You know, wind and solar companies don't build turbines or solar farms for the crack. They do it to make money.
Well, look, just to pick up on that then, the idea that, you know, this is a business that we're talking about ultimately is, so if we are capping the profits of these companies, you know, what's to stop them from just going elsewhere?
So I think that these, you know, if we introduce measures to tax oil and gas companies more, that needs to be part of a plan for a transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy. Now, we know that the climate crisis is incredibly urgent. In those countries you've mentioned, it's having really devastating impacts already, but it's also having starting to have devastating impacts here in the UK with things like, you know, people's homes being swallowed into the sea because of coastal erosion. So we really need to think about how we can get this process of a phase-out, an energy transition to renewable energy going much more quickly. And to do that, we need funding. Now, to me, the sensible and fair place to look for that funding is in the companies that have made, you know, this is a $1 trillion industry, whatever the cycles are. So these companies that have made huge amounts of money, more money than you and I could ever imagine, from polluting activities. To me, that's the concept of really, you know, if you break it, you buy it, rather than what seems to be happening now, which is if you break it, you can carry on making billions off it while the rest of us struggle.
So, you know, we're talking here about the amount of money that's being made, as Izzie says, whether that's cyclical or not. Are we at a point, though, that it will be inevitable that at some point we will have to phase out oil and gas and fossil fuels as such? You know, so at this point, should we be working on that, concentrating on that, using the money to move elsewhere?
We are, though. So 75% of UK
still
energy...
over 80% is still...
Globally, that's correct.
Right.
It is... Coal makes up a big chunk of that globally, and I think we would both agree getting coal out of the system should be a priority. But let's look at the UK. 75% of UK energy demand is oil and gas. Under the Climate Change Committee's net zero compliance scenarios, that'll be 25% in 2050. Every single costed scenario out to 2050 and beyond shows we will need oil and gas in the UK. The question is, where do we get it from? It is a simple fact that imports do not offer the economic, environmental, geopolitical and social advantages that domestic production does. On the tax point, so the new government have increased the tax rate to 78%, which is quite eye-watering. An oil and gas company will pay 3 times what an average corporation would do. That's the first point. Second point, I would argue there isn't a windfall at the minute. Other sectors have windfall profits and they're not being taxed. So I think the British
what about that,
independent...
Izzie, then? It's kind of a one, you know, you can't just tax the fuel companies and perhaps, you know, the renewable companies as well. They should be taxed in the same way. How do you make that split? How do you make the divide there? It's not fair.
Well, what we're talking about here, and if we want to talk about unfairness, we're talking about companies that are making billions and billions in profits from driving a climate crisis that is going to impact, you know, marginalised communities first, and it's going to, you know, it's already impacting climate vulnerable countries whose emissions are very low. So to me, that's incredibly unfair. And the fair thing to do would be to look to those companies to shoulder the burden first of resolving this crisis. Now, I would certainly also support a fairer energy system in general that prioritises people having access to affordable, people all around the world having access to affordable, reliable energy that does not herald climate breakdown before profit incentives for a very few people. So we can talk about that with the renewable industry, and we should be looking at that as we move through this transition. But what we really, really need to be doing first urgently is addressing this fossil fuel crisis.
And with that in mind, who pays for that then? If it's not going to be the fossil fuel companies, and there's the UK government's pledged £11 billion to tackle climate change. Why should it be the UK government footing the bill whenever these energy companies are making so much money?
The amount of money that's been put into UK decarbonisation is significant. The UK has reduced its emissions by 50% since 1990. During that period of time, globally, emissions have gone up by 60%. That is the real thing. My biggest concern is the tax levels that are currently being proposed could see 100,000 job losses in the oil and gas sector by 2030. So you saw the Grangemouth refinery said it was shutting down 400 jobs. The impact in the oil and gas industry is the same as the Grangemouth refinery closing every week from January 2025 until December 2029. That is politically unacceptable.
Can I just come in and say the Climate Change Committee has done an assessment that says that the net zero transition, if done in the right way, can create more jobs than it costs. Now, Charles is completely right to raise the issue of what is, fairness and equity in this transition and what's going to happen to workers in the fossil fuel industry. Again, the best way that we can manage that process is to support workers into the industries of the future, which is renewable energy. That's going to take funding. Why we shouldn't, look to the companies that have caused this crisis to provide some of that funding, as well as providing funding for global climate action.
You can do both. You can do both. Oil, gas and renewables.
Charles, Izzie, thank you so much. Really interesting conversations. Never enough time, but thank you very much for coming in today.
No worries. Thank you.
Fascinating discussion. Now, according